The buck kid cost 50 cents from the tail end of a dispersal sale on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1934. And the reason it cost 50 cents was that the auctioneer wanted the pen empty before dark, and nobody had raised a hand for an animal that looked like it wasn't going to see Friday. Wren Calloway had come to the Ostrander dispersal for a hay rake and a set of shearing blades, both of which she'd gotten before noon at a fair price. She was loading the rake onto the flatbed when she heard the sound from behind the last pen. A thin, broken bleat. Not the ordinary complaint of a hungry kid, but something with less strength behind it than that. She walked back around the loading chute and looked down into the pen. The buck kid was maybe 3 weeks old, curled against the rail with his legs folded under him at an angle that wasn't right, his breathing shallow and quick, his coat matted with scours and barn dirt, so that what should have been white was closer to gray. But even through the dirt she could see it. The fiber coming in along his back had a crimp to it, tight and even and fine. Nothing like the coarse guard hair of an ordinary goat, and where the afternoon light caught it, it held a soft, silvery luster that didn't belong to a half-dead kid in the bottom of a livestock pen. Ostrander's hired man said the dam had rejected him after a hard birth, and nobody had the time or the inclination to bottle raise a buck kid that was probably going to die anyway, Angora or not. 50 cents and he was hers, or the auctioneer would knock him on the head before they hauled off the rest of the pens. She paid the 50 cents. Her name was Wren Calloway. She was 24 and had been running her father's 40 acres alone in Comanche County, Kansas, since pneumonia took him in the winter of 1932, working the wheat ground with a hired team twice a year and keeping 11 Rambouillet ewes that brought in just enough wool money to cover the taxes. She had been reading about Angora goats since the previous autumn. 4 letters exchanged with a Mohair buyer in San Angelo, Texas, named Foster Reyes, whose advertisement she had clipped from a stockman's journal that still came to the house addressed to her father out of habit. Reyes had written back with numbers, Mohair prices, twice what her Rambouillet wool brought by the pound, and a note that clean white kid mohair with tight ringlet crimp was the specific thing his buyers in the fine goods trade were asking for and could not get enough of, because domestic supply had never recovered from what the Depression had done to import volume out of Turkey, where the breed originated, and out of South Africa, where most of the world's mohair now came from, and where shipping costs had put the price out of reach for half his usual customers. She had run those numbers against her 40 acres and decided she needed foundation stock, 2 or 3 does and a buck with clean lines before autumn. This was not the buck she had planned to buy. He was scoured and folded wrong in a livestock pen with 50 cents standing between him and the auctioneer's mallet. But she had learned from her father that the animal in front of you was sometimes worth more than the animal in the catalog, and she paid the 50 cents and carried him to the flatbed wrapped in a feed sack because he couldn't stand. She named him Sultan for the empire the breed had come out of before the export ban lifted the previous century and animals finally left the country in numbers, which she'd read in one of Reyes's letters and thought suited an animal that had survived the odds just by being born the wrong color in a livestock pen. She built him a warming box from a feed crate lined with wool batting in the kitchen, because the barn at night in March wasn't going to keep a scouring 3-week-old alive, and mixed electrolyte solution the way her father's veterinary manual described, small frequent doses through a rubber-tipped syringe, moving to diluted goat milk once his gut settled, checking him every 3 hours through the first 2 nights the way farm people check an animal that is genuinely on the edge of it. By the 3rd day, his breathing had steadied. By the 5th day, he took the bottle without help. By the 10th day, he stood on his own and looked at her through a fringe of dirty white hair with the specific alertness of an animal that has decided, on its own authority, to keep going. Before we find out what Wren builds from a 50-cent buck kid and 2 borrowed shearing combs, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel reaches people from all across the country, and we love knowing where these stories land. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. New stories every week. Jonah Ridley came to the east fence on the 2nd Saturday of April with a question about the shared stock tank, which sat exactly on the property line and needed its float valve replaced before the cattle on both sides ran short in the dry weeks that were already starting to show themselves that spring. He farmed the section east of hers, 160 acres of wheat, and a small cow-calf operation he'd been running since his own father moved to town 2 winters back. He was 27, dark-haired, going towards Sandy at the temples from the sun, built long through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd spent his life pitching hay and stringing wire. They had known each other the ordinary amount that Comanche County neighbors knew each other, which was to say well enough to nod at church and not well enough to have had a real conversation since her father's funeral. He fixed the float valve without being asked twice, and then stood at the fence a moment too long looking toward the barn, where Sultan, 3 weeks out of the warming box and steadier on his legs every day, was picking his way across the yard with the deliberate, unhurried gait that Angora kids had once they decided the ground could be trusted. "What is that?" he said. "An Angora buck kid," she said. "Bought him at the Ostrander sale for 50 cents. He watched Sultan a moment longer. "He's small," he said. "He was smaller," she said. Jonah nodded the way a man nods when he has more question than he's decided to ask out loud, and went back to his own fence line. He came back the following Tuesday without any stock tank to fix. He came back the Tuesday after that. By May, he had stopped inventing reasons, and she had stopped expecting one, and this arrangement suited them both well enough that neither one commented on it. The scours had cost Sultan some early growth, but Angora kids that survived a hard start often caught up fast once the gut settled, and by 6 weeks he was matching the size of kids that had never been sick at all, the coat coming in clean now that she had him on full milk and creep feed, the crimp tightening into the small, tight ringlets that were the specific mark of the breed at its best, dense along his back and sides, finer than anything she had felt on the Rambouillets, with a luster under the porch lamp in the evening that made him look, she thought, less like a barnyard animal and more like something spun rather than born. She wrote to Reyes in San Angelo describing the crimp and the handle and the color, and he wrote back within 3 weeks asking her to send a sample lock. She cut a small lock from his flank, packaged it in waxed paper, and mailed it to Texas. Reyes's reply came back with a number that told her Sultan's fiber, at the fineness he was describing, was going to sit at the very top of the mohair grading scale. Kid mohair, fine and lustrous, worth close to double what adult mohair brought, because the fiber only stayed that fine through the first several shearings before it coarsened with age, and buyers paid for that narrow window specifically. She understood the economics of the breed the way she had learned to understand everything about the farm since her father died, which was thoroughly and without sentiment. An Angora goat was shorn twice a year, spring and fall, producing 4 to 6 pounds of mohair per adult animal per shearing at maturity, kids yielding somewhat less at their first 2 shearings, but at the premium kid mohair price that more than made up the difference in the ledger. The fiber itself came off in long locks, not the crimped staple of sheep's wool, and had to be handled differently through the shearing, kept clean of vegetable matter, and skirted carefully at the edges where the coarser hair grew, because a single contaminated lock could drop the grade on an entire clip. She had learned this from Reyes's letters and from a bulletin the extension office sent her when she wrote asking, and she had built a shearing table from planed lumber, specifically so the fleece would fall clean onto canvas rather than dirt, because dirt in a mohair clip was the fastest way to turn a premium fiber into a discount one. The business logic settled itself clearly in her mind that spring, and she never revisited it as though it were new. The goats were not livestock she intended to sell for meat or breeding stock at auction. The fiber was the income, twice a year, animal after animal, year after year, and an animal that produced income twice annually was worth more standing in the pasture than it would ever be worth sold once. Jonah helped her build the shearing table on a Saturday in May without being asked how, only whether she wanted the legs braced at a height for standing or sitting, which told her he'd thought about the actual mechanics of the work before he arrived with his tools. He didn't tell her whether the operation made sense. He asked good questions about the parts he didn't understand, how the crimp graded, what a lock looked like versus a staple, and answered them himself once she'd explained it once, filing the information away the way she noticed he filed most things, quietly and for later use. Reyes wrote in June with a specific request. Could she supply 24 breeding does of any quality by autumn, because a wool cooperative outside San Angelo was trying to establish new Angora flocks across 3 states to meet demand the South African imports couldn't satisfy, and Kansas had almost no established Angora stock at all. She wrote back that she had 1 buck and no does yet, and could deliver perhaps a dozen within the year if she found foundation stock she trusted. He gave her the name of a breeder outside Uvalde who was dispersing part of his herd, and she spent most of June writing letters and running numbers in the notebook she kept in her apron pocket, calculating what a herd of 15 does bred to Sultan would produce against what the freight would cost to bring them up from Texas, against what she could clear from the spring Rambouillet wool that was already baled in the shed waiting on the co-op's truck. The county had opinions about all of this. Hollis Merritt at the feed store told her twice that goats were a fool's animal, that Angoras specifically were a novelty breed nobody in Kansas had ever made money on. She thanked him both times with the particular courtesy she reserved for opinions she had no intention of revising her plans around. Della Fenwick at the church social mentioned to several people that Wren had gone strange since her father passed, spending 50 cents on a dying goat and writing letters to Texas about it. Word of this reached her the usual way, and she did not trouble herself over it. Doyle Ashworth, the county extension agent, drove out in July and was different. He ran his hand down Sultan's flank fiber with the care of a man checking something he already suspected was good, and said Mohair had real commercial legs behind it, that the import figures backed her up, and that if the fiber graded out the way it looked, she was sitting on something the county hadn't seen before. We're halfway through this story, and we want to know, have you ever raised an animal everyone told you not to bother with? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your reminder. New stories every week. Sultan's first shearing came in September, 6 months old and carrying a full coat of ringlet mohair that Wren had been watching build all summer with the weekly measurements she recorded in the notebook. Lock length, crimp count per inch, the specific silvery cast of the fiber that Reyes had said in his last letter buyers were going to fight over if the volume ever existed to fight over. She sheared him herself on the table Jonah had built, working the hand shears in long, even strokes the way the extension bulletin described, keeping the fleece intact in one piece so it fell clean onto the canvas rather than tearing into pieces that would grade down. It came off in a single fleece weighing just under 3 pounds, extraordinary for a first shearing off a 6-month kid, and when she spread it out on the canvas in the September light, it held that silver-white luster she had first seen through the dirt in the bottom of Ostrander's pen. Tight ringlet crimp running the full length of every lock, clean of vegetable matter because she had kept him off burr-heavy pasture all summer, specifically to protect the clip. She packaged the fleece to Reyes's specifications, skirted, rolled, wrapped in clean muslin, and shipped it to San Angelo in the last week of September. The reply came back inside 3 weeks with a grading report and a check that made her sit down at the kitchen table before she did anything else with it. Reyes had graded the fleece as fine kid mohair, top of the scale, and named a price per pound that was nearly triple what her Rambouillet wool cleared on 3 pounds of fiber off a single 6-month-old animal that had cost her 50 cents in March and would produce a comparable clip again in the spring and twice a year for every year after that, as long as he lived. She drove to Hollis Merritt's feed store the following Monday and bought her usual order of chick feed and did not mention the check because she had learned since her father died that the numbers spoke for themselves eventually and didn't need her assistance in the speaking. But Jonah was at the fence that Thursday, and when she told him the figure, he was quiet long enough that she understood he was doing the arithmetic the way he always did, out loud in his head before it reached his mouth. 3 pounds, he said finally, off one animal. First shearing, she said. He'll clear more in the spring once he's matured into full growth, and that's before the does start producing anything at all. He looked toward the barn, where Sultan stood at the gate watching them both with the calm, faintly imperious attention that Angora bucks seemed to develop once they understood their own value, though she doubted an animal understood anything of the kind and suspected it was simply confidence, the kind that came naturally to a creature that had beaten long odds and knew it. "You're going to Texas for the does," Jonah said. It wasn't a question so much as him arriving somewhere she'd already been for a month. "In October," she said. "Ashworth gave me a name outside Uvalde. 15 head if the numbers hold and the freight isn't too dear." He was quiet again, the particular quiet she'd come to recognize as him working something through before he said it. "I could drive you down," he said, Save the freight on at least part of the trip if we haul a trailer ourselves instead of paying a shipper both ways." She looked at him a long moment. "That's 4 days on the road," she said. "I've got 4 days," he said. "The wheat's in and the cattle are settled till November." She turned it over. It would save considerable money, and Jonah drove a truck the way he did most things, carefully and without waste. "All right," she said. "October," she said. He came back the following Tuesday with a map of the route already worked out. They drove to Uvalde together in the second week of October, the Kansas plains giving way slowly to Texas scrub country. 4 days there and back with the trailer empty going down and 15 Angora does loaded for the return, 3 bucks among them of different bloodlines to keep the breeding sound. Jonah helped her load and unload at every stop without being asked how. They got the trailer home on a Friday evening with the October light going long and gold, turned the does into the new pasture Wren had fenced through September, and stood at the rail watching them work out their opinions of Sultan, who approached the fence with the settled confidence of an animal that had already decided, in his own mind, exactly whose pasture this was. The breeding went through in November, and by December, Wren had the pregnancy dates recorded against the standard 150-day Angora gestation. Kidding expected in late April into May, timed deliberately to land after the last hard frost, since Angora kids were notoriously poor at regulating body heat in their first weeks, and a late cold snap could wipe out a season's crop in a single bad night, the way it had nearly taken Sultan himself. She spent the winter converting the Hetty Barn's East Bay into a kidding shed with draft-free pens and heat lamps, working most Saturdays with Jonah, who by December had stopped inventing reasons to be there and simply showed up. The kidding came through April and May as projected, 22 kids off 15 does, a strong crop by any standard, and Wren spent 3 weeks sleeping in the hay barn in the way farm people slept during kidding season, present and calibrated, checking each doe through the night, pulling 2 kids that came breech and needed help finding the world, losing only 1 kid to a cold night in the second week that no amount of watching could have prevented, which she recorded in the notebook without flinching from it, because her father had taught her that an honest ledger recorded the losses along with the gains, or it wasn't worth keeping. 21 kids stood at the end of it, 11 does and 10 bucklings, and Sultan's own get among them carrying the same tight silvery crimp that had first caught her eye through the dirt of a livestock pen 14 months before. The spring shearing in May told her what she had: 5 adult does and 3 adult bucks off the Uvalde stock, plus Sultan himself, shearing out at just under 30 pounds of mohair combined, graded across 2 qualities and shipped to Reyes in 2 separate lots so the grades wouldn't mix and pull the average down. The check that came back in June was more money than the entire farm had cleared in any single year since her father died, and it came, she reminded herself, from an animal twice a year, not from a single sale of anything, the herd growing every season rather than shrinking with each transaction, the way a cattle herd shrank every time an animal went to auction. Jonah was at the kitchen table when she opened the letter, because by June he came to the kitchen table as often as he came to the fence, and she had stopped remarking on it the same way she'd stopped remarking on most things that had simply become true over the past year, without an announcement attached. He read the figure twice. 30 pounds, he said, off 8 animals and a 50-cent buck kid that shouldn't have lived past March. He wouldn't have, she said, if I hadn't gone back around that loading chute. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had watched shift over 15 months, from a neighbor's mild concern to something considerably less mild and considerably more decided. You went back around the chute because you heard something the rest of us didn't, he said. That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's always been the whole thing. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Leave a comment below. What's the smallest, most unlikely purchase you've ever made that turned into something real? Your stories are what makes this community what it is. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll have a new story for you next week. By the following spring, the herd stood at 41 head, the fall and spring shearings together clearing more in a single year than the wheat ground had cleared in the 3 years before it. Reyes had written twice more asking whether she could supply breeding stock to 2 other operations in Kansas and Nebraska, starting their own flocks off proven bloodlines, a third income line running alongside the fiber. Breeding stock sold outward while her own core herd stayed intact and growing. Hollis Merritt had stopped repeating himself about Fool's animals somewhere in the second year, though he never said so directly, only started asking, when she came in for feed, how the goats were doing this season, which in Comanche County passed for a formal retraction. Jonah came to the back door now instead of the fence, the door a man used once he'd stopped being a visitor, and on a Saturday evening in October, 18 months after he'd fixed a stock tank valve on a pretext neither of them had needed to name for very long, he sat across the kitchen table with the account book open between them. 41 head, he said. Off one buck kid. He looked up. I've been thinking about the north pasture on my side, he said. The section that runs against your fence line. She waited. It's good browse for goats, better than it ever was for cattle. I was thinking there might be a different kind of arrangement to make about it, if that's something you'd want to think through. What kind, she said, though she had a reasonable idea. The kind that goes on record at the courthouse, he said, if you'd have it. Outside, the herd was settling into the evening the way Angora goats settled, unhurried and sure of themselves, Sultan's low call carrying across the yard the way it always did at dusk. Wren looked at the man across the table who had shown up for a stock tank valve and stayed for everything after, and thought about a Thursday in March and 50 cents and a bleat that hadn't sounded like it had much strength left behind it. I'd think it through, she said. Saturday, he said. Bring the survey map, she said. The corner of his mouth did the thing it had been doing more often since June. Saturday, he said. She had gone back around that loading chute because something in the sound had told her to look, and she had learned in the 14 months since that this was most of what mattered in the end. Not the 50 cents and not the county's opinion of it, but the going back, the looking closely at the thing everyone else had already decided wasn't worth the trouble. Her father had never lived to see the herd or the ledger, or the man who came to the back door on Saturdays, but she thought, standing at the window with the October evening going gold over the pasture, that he would have recognized the whole of it immediately, because it was exactly the kind of thing he had spent his life teaching her to see.